Hi, I'm Carl Shelshay. Welcome to ePrep. I've spent the last couple months videotaping myself giving advice on how to take the SAT. But I know that getting a good SAT score is not all you need to do to get into a good college. There's a lot you need to know about financial aid and admissions. And while I'm not an expert in those fields, I have some friends who are. And I recently had the opportunity to sit down and talk to Don Betterton. Don is the former financial aid director at Princeton University. He was there for 30 years in that position. And I got to know Don back in the late 80s when he was one of the assistant soccer coaches and I was on the varsity soccer team. And so Don and I have known each other for a long time. He's a great guy. And I asked him what I could do today before my kids are even in high school to help make paying for college easier when my kids finally do get to college. So I grabbed my video camera, sat down with Don, and hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation. So Don, I'm excited. I'm about to learn the 12 things I need to know about saving for college for my children. Your first bullet is called putting aside money for college is a good idea. The earlier the better. My question for you would be, who is it a good idea for, me or my children?
Actually, it's a good idea for both. What I like to do is compare savings versus borrowing, because if you don't save now, the chances are your child is going to have to borrow later on. So I have an example here. How old are your children?
I have a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 6-year-old.
Okay, well, my example is based on a 5-year-old, so let's start with that. 13 years until college. You start putting aside money when your son is 5 years old. You put aside $2,000 per year. Over that 13-year period, you set aside $26,000. The interest accumulation over that period of time will mean you'll have $40,000 ready to go to college when he's 18 years old. Let's say you don't do that. You don't put aside any money at all. You still need $40,000. Now you have to borrow that money. He takes out a student loan, graduates with $40,000 worth of indebtedness. He has to repay that at a 6.8% interest rate over a 10-year period. Guess how much he'll have to repay?
$55,200.
I think you've been looking at that sheet. Anyway, so that's a good point. In one sense, with the savings, you put aside $26,000 for the $40,000. Borrowing, he borrows the same $40,000, has to repay $55,000. So it's almost a $30,000 difference in this example between savings and borrowing.
Right, and I agree with you. I think that if you do the numbers, it works out to be $167 per month for me right now. And I think that if you start putting away that amount of money, you just get used to it. You learn to live without it, and before you know it, you have this nest egg. It's ready for the children and their college education. And so just to recap, your point number 2 was saving beats borrowing hands down. I agree with you 100%. Can you explain for me point number 3, which is the tax system gives incentives to college savers? What does that mean?
Yeah, it sure does. There's something called the 529 plan, which the government has set up, and that's a provision of the Internal Revenue Service that says you do not have to pay taxes on money put in this particular college savings plan. Not only do you not have to pay federal taxes, but you don't have to pay state taxes. So what it means is this money accumulates without any tax payments over this 13-year period we talked about. That's a substantial difference if you accumulate money paying taxes every year versus not paying taxes. Okay. Example I like to use would be if you set aside at age 0 when your child is born $18,000, a one-time payment you put aside. If you have to pay taxes on that over a period of 18 years, you'll have accumulated $43,000. If you do it in a 529 plan with all the advantages inherent in that, you'll actually accumulate $63,000. So there's quite a difference in your pocket, your out-of-pocket expense in savings in any way that's taxable versus the 529 plans, which are not taxable either the federal or the state level.
So really what it comes down to is there's a $20,000 difference in your example. That would go to me and my child's education versus...
Right. It's a government subsidy for saving for college, basically.
Okay, so your point number 4 is 529 plans are the most popular and convenient way to save. What are 529 plans? 529
plans are this government-sponsored savings plan, which are now by far the most popular way to save for college. I think there's like $100 billion in these plans as of the current time. Wow. And they simply are, I think, the most convenient, easy way to save for college.
Now you say government plans. Are they federal or state plans for the most part?
The federal government puts in the rules as far as these tax advantages that we talked about. But actually the plans are set up within each state. They establish their own. And so when they look at 529 plans, you normally start looking at your own state plan because there's certain advantages as far as state tax deductions. There may be some scholarship benefits, whatever. But there's also a very good website called savingforcollege.com, all one word, savingforcollege, then .com. And I think it's worthwhile before one invests in one's own state plan to at least go on that website and check some of the provisions of other state plans to see whether your state's offering the best deal for you or whether you might even do better by going to another state.
Okay, which you just answered your point 5, which is not all 529 plans are alike. You should shop around. And the website was college savings.
Savingforcollege.com.
Sorry about that. Savingforcollege.com. Number 6, what if the beneficiary doesn't go to college or gets a full scholarship? Now, you know all of my children are going to get full rides. So
right.
It's a complete waste of time for me, but let's just pretend they're not as special as I think they are.
Well, if you can't use any of your children, do you have any nephews or nieces, I guess is my question.
I do. Both of my sisters have kids, so I have 2 nieces and 3 nephews.
Okay. Well, the way they've set up the rules is you initially establish a beneficiary. If he or she does not go to college, has a scholarship or whatever, you can then move the money around to other beneficiaries, including your whole family, cousins, first cousins. If you want to go back to school, you can use it yourself. You can actually skip a generation and even go to your grandchildren, but we won't get into that right now.
Well, speaking of different generations, my parents have at times expressed an interest in helping me save for my children's education. Is it, first of all, typical for grandparents to want to get involved? And if they want to, can they get involved?
Yeah. I read a recent poll that said 2/3 of grandparents would like to help their grandchildren with college to some extent. A 529 plan is an excellent option for grandparents. We haven't talked about the effect of the financial aid formula on these savings yet, but there's kind of a light tax on savings that would be held in the parent's name. If the grandparents save the money for college, they're not part of the financial aid system at all, so one doesn't even have to worry about that. The other advantage of grandparents is that as they're building up their estate and they move this money, and none of it counts, even though they're the owner in their estate. So it's actually a good estate planning technique as well. And farther down the line, they'll help their grandchildren, which I'm sure they really would like to do.
Yeah. Okay, now we talked a little bit before about, what is the right amount to save. Now you threw out some examples of $167 a month, and I asked you a question, well, what if I can't save that much, what should I do? And the other variable is, I don't know how expensive school is going to be.
Right,
when they get to that age. Is there sort of a right amount to save, or how do you go about figuring out what the right amount is?
The easiest answer to that is simply say what you can afford after you take care, as we talked about before, your current living expenses, your retirement protection, whatever. If one wants to set a target figure, I think a reasonable one is the out-of-state tuition for whoever your flagship public institution is. In New Jersey, use Rutgers as an example. The out-of-state tuition for a student who comes from out-of-state and attends Rutgers is about $17,000 a year currently. And if you take that and you inflate over a period of time, that ends up being 13 years, using the same 5-year-old example, $168,000 you're facing way down the line. And you'd have to put aside about $450 a month to meet a target like that over that period of time. So some families can't afford it. If you could afford that, it's a very good number to shoot for, because then if your student stays in state, that amount of money will probably pay for tuition plus room plus board. And if they go to a private institution, they'll probably pay for a good part of the private institution's tuition. So it's a reasonable target figure. It can be expensive, but if that's not possible, any amount you save is better than not saving at all.
Don, one last question on a topic that we didn't really cover, I don't think, in the last segment, and that is, will I ultimately be penalized if I'm the good person who saves and does everything I'm supposed to when I get to that financial aid award when my kids get to school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hear that quite a bit. Am I penalized for saving? Whether it's in a 529 plan or any other form of savings, the financial aid formula is really fairly light on how they treat savings. Let me give you an example. If by the time your son gets to college you have $100,000 in some form or another, savings, investments, 529 plans, the financial aid formula first said you can reserve $50,000 of that. We won't even look at that. So now they only look at $50,000 of your $100,000. And what's called the tax rate on that, the amount that's added to your contribution, is 5%. So going through the math, 5% of $50,000 is $2,500. So your contribution is now going to be $2,500 greater because you have $100,000. So I think that's really a fairly light treatment of those savings. As a matter of fact, if the 100,000 gains some interest during the year, chances are you can simply pay some interest off the top of it and never actually have to touch the principal at all. So whether it's 529 plans or any other form of savings, it's a good idea, and the financial aid system really treats it fairly lightly.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge and your willingness to share it with me.
Thank you.